Hello. Yeah, okay. And hello, everyone. I'm the chairperson of the Deaf Heritage Centre here. And I'd like to welcome you all to here to the Deaf Heritage Centre, and thank you to Alvin Jones for setting up the PowerPoint. Well, she tried her best, but luckily we have the laptop and we can look in at those slides. And if you can't see any of them, you can move up a seat, help yourselves. And just to start, to tell you about the fire escapes, or the door through which you came, and there's a second door to my right here downstairs. So on the left and left again for the fire exit, and you can go down near the toilets, isn't that right? Or just out through that door. Oh, sorry, there's a toilet there, and if there's a men's toilets downstairs, there's a women's toilets there. Okay, Alvin is just correcting me. The men's toilets is downstairs, the women's toilet is there. Okay. The first break will be at 11 o'clock, and we're going to go to the hub at 11 o'clock for 15 minutes, and then come back here, and lunch is at 1 o'clock, and then we can come back in again. And I'd like a warm welcome. I'd like to introduce Una and Kate. They're going to talk about Teresa. Today, we're going to talk about Teresa Deevy and her day-to-day life. Welcome.
And thank you. We are going to talk initially for 30 minutes, and then we'll take a break for Fergie, and then we'll have another 15 minutes after that. We're so happy to be here, and thank you for driving here or walking here. We're really grateful for joining us today.
Kate and I work in SETU, and we lecture in English and theatre studies there. And our work in recent years has been in relation to Teresa Deevy. We were lucky enough to see and write about a performance by Dublin Theatre of the Deaf, working with Amanda Coogan, and that was our first experience of theatre made by deaf artists. And it was a transformative experience for us, because certainly for me, it was one of the best theatre productions I've ever seen. It was amazing. So we are so pleased to be here and so privileged to give this talk about Teresa Deevy, who has given us so much in our own career. The title of our talk today is What Teresa Did at School, an analysis of how schoolgirl theatrical activity in St. Mary's Secondary School, Waterford, influenced Teresa Deevy's dramaturgical practice. Attending an all-girls Catholic secondary school in the early 1900s lent a particular political and cultural shade of green to the educational experience of young Irish women. In this lecture, we consider how Waterford playwright Teresa Deevy's school days in St. Mary's Secondary School, the Ursuline Convent, may have impacted her expectations and aspirations as a young woman entering into the most volatile and interesting time in Irish history, and how these are expressed in her ballet entitled Possession, or Cattle of the Gods. Over the next 40 minutes, we will present some of our research suggesting that Deevy's education and her extracurricular activities in the Ursuline Convent, how they are, as expressed in the St. Ursula's Annuals published in the early 1900s, form the intellectual and creative groundwork to her later dramatic work. We will, during the later part of the lecture, illustrate this through specific reference to Deevy's ballet possession. Our lecture positions Deevy's work within the social and the political context of the 20s and 30s, and articulates some of our research into Deevy's time as a schoolgirl in Waterford, undertaken within Southeast Technological University as part of the Performing the Region research project. We are pleased to acknowledge that the insights, patience, and expertise of many friends and academics, and the kindness and generosity of Sister June Fennelly, who has educated and inspired many Waterford women in her role as teacher and also as principal of the Ursuline Convent, and who has provided us with access to copies of the St. Ursula's Annual, and has given us permission to use many of the images that you will see as the presentation progresses. Sister June continues to safeguard, curate, and share the archive of the Ursuline Convent community, which is such an important sociological archive unique to Waterford City. Yeah, apologies. Next. So you can skip. The Irish Cultural Revival was a revival of arts and culture at the turn of the century and reached into the first few decades of the 20th century. Anthony Roach dates the dramatic revival from 1898 and states that it ends with Yeats' death in 1939. Declan Kyberd describes the Irish literary revival as follows. It was the grand destiny of Yeats's generation to make Ireland once again interesting to the Irish, after centuries of enforced provincialism following the collapse of the Gaelic order in 1601. No generation before or since lived with such conscious national intensity or left such an inspiring and in some ways intimidating legacy. Though they could be fractious, its members set themselves the highest standards of imaginative integrity and personal generosity. Imbued with republican and democratic ideals, they committed themselves in no spirit of chauvinism, but in the conviction that the Irish might expand the expressive freedoms of all individuals. Writing the first production of Yeats and Augusta Gregory's Kathleen na Houlihan, and you'll see a production on the screen, Christopher Morash asserts that the entrance of Kathleen into the Galan cottage offers the possibility of instantaneous magical transformation. For those of you not familiar with Kathleen na Houlihan, Kathleen was the spirit of Ireland. She appeared in the Galan's cottage as an old woman, but energized by the arrival of the French in Killala Bay. She left the house, as the young boy Patrick says at the end of the play, with the walk of a queen. In the image that you can see on the screen, Kathleen was played by Maud Gonne. Of course, we know Maud Gonne is famously W.B. Yeats's muse. Maud Gonne, or Kathleen na Houlihan, enters representing Ireland, but an Ireland that is depleted, that is in need of regeneration. That regeneration is brought about by the lifeblood of the men who go and fight for Ireland. Slightly vampiric, this drawing of the blood of the young men of Ireland so that Kathleen can live again. This is the magical transformation that Christopher Morash describes when he talks about
Kathleen Nugula offering a possibility of magical transformation. But that phrase, transformation, could also be understood as capturing the intensity that drove artists and activists. Their ambition was to transform and reinvigorate Irish culture and national identity into something to be celebrated as uniquely Irish, as a culture and heritage that was richly textured, intellectually complex, and powerfully resonant. And as I stand here today, I'm reminded of the parallels of the richly complex, layered, and interesting, unique cultural heritage that is the Irish deaf heritage, and which Alvin and George will explore in their forthcoming anthology. And in a way, what was happening in the literary revival is that there was the same attempt to celebrate, to investigate, and to explore this interesting, complex, rich cultural heritage. Our intention this morning is to consider briefly how aspects of the complex social and political and cultural tapestry of the early years of the 20th century can be read through the St. Ursula's Annuals, written and created during Deevy's time in St. Mary's, before briefly considering how these influences emerge in her ballet possession. After this lecture, we'll have a workshop which is much more interactive and in which you'll do some of the work thinking about a play called The King of Spain's Daughter. And in the afternoon, we'll go on and we'll explore how the King of Spain's Daughter can be understood through the body. So that's a little outline of what will happen today. But so just you can rest easy for this morning and just listen and see how that Irish literary revival feeds into what Teresa Deevy did later on in her work.
So Teresa, or Tessa, was the last of 13 children. Her father died when she was 3. Her mother, Mary Feehan Deevy, prioritised her daughter's education, and upon reaching secondary school age, Teresa attended St. Mary's Secondary School at the Ursuline Convent as a boarder, as many girls of well-to-do families did at that time. Teresa boarded at the Ursuline Convent, a short distance from her home, and was taught by a community of Catholic sisters with 100 years' experience in educating young women. One of her sisters, Mary, was a nun at the Ursuline when Teresa was a boarder. But Mary, or Mal, she was also known, endured poor health and died as a result of contracting the Spanish flu, which struck Waterford in 1917, 5 years after Teresa had left school. 2 of Teresa's sisters became nuns, and 1 brother became a Jesuit priest. None of her other 5 sisters married. The onset of Meniere's disease occurred whilst Deevy was a student at UCD studying for her arts degree. She returned home before moving to Cork to complete her degree at UCC. Thereafter, she went to London to study lit reading, and her interest in theatre grew. She would often read the script before she went to see the play. The plays of Chekhov and Shaw appealed to her particularly, and she had resolved on becoming a dramatist by the time she returned to Ireland in 1919, aged 25. During this time, she became politically active, joining Cumann na mBan and visiting prisoners in Ballybricken jail. Just going to check the next. Is there another slide on this one? I think we have 2. So this is the family. And Teresa. And then the next one should be them in school. Yes, okay. So we know from St. Ursula's Annual that Deevy was interested in and very active in sports, in music and literary activities whilst at school. So here you can see a picture of the senior division with Deevy seated third from the right on the first row. And the boarders were cared for by a chaplain, a medical attendant.
Just need to wait for eye contact.
Yeah, sorry. A trained nurse, a drill master, a dancing mistress, and an Irish dancing mistress. So the Ursuline Convent was also housed St. Augustine's College, a teacher training college, and this opened in 1896, and in 1898 it was formally affiliated with the University of Cambridge as a training college for teachers of secondary and intermediate schools. The annual states that St. Augustine's was, and I'm quoting here, the first practical attempt to remedy a universally acknowledged defect in the educational system of this country. End quote. Significantly, what student teachers learned was the theory, the history, and the practice of education. Now, Deevy was a schoolgirl and not a trainee teacher, but it seems that she and her school friends benefited from their association with a team of women dedicated to the development of innovative and experiential pedagogy. Borders, that next. Keep going.
We've got a picture of the house, the school, the boarding school.
Yes. So a short description that typifies the social interaction the girls experienced is found in a short extract entitled "The Juniors' Christmas Tree." Though this extract is not by Deevy, it describes the atmosphere and the sense of community between the girls who attended as boarders and the staff who cared for them. And Una will now read the extract. This is our little performance that we do as part of our gig.
We were all looking forward to the Christmas holidays with intense eagerness when our mistress invited us to a Christmas tree in the Angels' Room. Here, everything was carefully and thoughtfully prepared for our enjoyment. The cheerful fire, soft lights, and Christmas tree, which glistened with so many pretty souvenirs, all served as a foretaste of the home comforts we were soon to enjoy. We had a most enjoyable evening indeed, and we left for the holidays a few days afterwards with many pleasant recollections of our first term.
So what we now recognize as what must have been an ideal learning environment, one in which learning is enhanced through the creation of relationships based on mutuality, hospitality, trust, and good humor. We see this created in the extract that Una has just read. And it was created by these socially interactive extracurricular experiences that were carefully designed and delivered within St. Mary's.
Part of the carefully designed extracurricular activities were theatre productions. And we're going to talk to you a little bit about those in the next few minutes. But before we move on to that, I'll tell you a little bit about a really important figure in Deevy's life, and that was her mother, Mary. Mary Deevy encouraged her daughter to write and to invent small stories about everyday things in the house. And that's Deevy's quote. Her mother told her to write small stories about everyday things in the house. Her mother recognizing the importance of the domestic space and how stories and important events happened within this space. And this was new ground for Irish theatre. It wasn't the French landing at Killala. It wasn't the transformation of Ireland into a beautiful queen. It was the everyday things that happened that were momentous in this space. And this is where Deevy's dramaturgy is innovative. It breaks new ground. It was Mary Deevy's ambition that Teresa should write a book. And though Mary died, her mother, in 1930, the year that Teresa Deevy's first play, Reapers, was staged in the Abbey. In 1936, Teresa did publish her first book, a collection of plays, which she dedicated to her mother. And in the flyleaf, in the dedication, it reads, "To Mother, as we planned." So we can see how formative an influence Deevy's mother was on her writing. The seed of Teresa's plan to write and publish, supported by her mother, found fertile soil in Teresa's education in St. Mary's, where she was one of a total of 81 girls in 1911. The annual for that year reveals a formal and informal curriculum of music, sport, drama, critical writing, journalistic writing, and debating. A debate that year, reported in the annual, asked participants and audience to consider whether women should have equal social and political rights with men. So right from the start in her education, Deevy is thinking about equality. She's debating it. She's writing about it, right from the very start. And what we want to get to at the end of the lecture is to show that how in her play Possession, she's still writing about these things. She's still thinking about these things. She's still exploring that agenda. Also that year, a series of guest lecturers arrived at the school. They offered lectures on the Irish journalist and Gothic fiction writer Sheridan Lefanu. They offered lectures on history, the development of Irish music, St. Bridget, and the genre of the Passion Play. Regular trips to musical recitals and concerts in the city occurred, and the students were encouraged to write poetry, short stories, and to write and perform original plays. Deevy wrote short pieces on the books that she and her classmates read and had read to them as part of evening recreational activities. In a piece entitled "Books We Have Read," Deevy's love of literature emanates from her reflections on the literature that she and her friends had enjoyed that year. And now Kate's going to do some reading.
One evening, on coming up to class for recreation, we found a strange blue atmosphere. On examination, we discovered that the cause of this change was the presence of a hitherto unknown creature called the blue bird. The room was so beautifully and suddenly transformed by this unexpected visitor that each one was filled with curiosity for what was to come. Maeterlinck's Blue Bird. And
short pieces such as these reveal Deevy as what Kathy Leaney describes: optimistic, energetic, intellectually alive. she's a student with an infectious ebullience, as another writer says. Literary creativity, and in particular dramatic writing, was especially encouraged at St. Mary's, which we know because the texts of the short plays written and produced by the girls are published in the annual. Two of Deevy's classmates wrote a play entitled Our School in 1960. The world of the play is one in which food is ingested in tablet form. The planet Mars is easily visited before jetting off to a geology lecture on Saturn. With amazing foresight, the stage directions describe the setting as a room featuring, and I'm quoting, many phones and speaking tubes attached to the wall. They imagine the internet. They could see it all in 1912. Although not written by Deevy, the play reveals the aspirations of girls in 1911 to, as one character, Ethna, articulates it, make their mark somehow. Interestingly, the drama ends with a visiting woman professor urging the girls to become, and I'm quoting, pioneers of Ireland's greatest need, the making of the home through the acquirement of a good domestic training. I see Alvin frowning. So we have this strange conflict between an aspiration to be a scientist, a mathematics professor, an astronaut, conflicting with what women are being told by other women, which is to stay at home and learn how to be, and to apply that scientific discipline to the home. So we can see the girls in 1911 fighting with this conflict. And again, this is a thread that runs through Deevy's work. I talk with my hands, and I'm trying not to. But if I do, forgive me. This final line about making the home encapsulates the tension that emerges when, having educated young women to aspire to equality across all disciplines, these women come to the conclusion that homemaking is only one option, and possibly a lackluster option, in comparison to the thrills experienced by women mathematicians, tea plantation owners, astrophysicists, and pilots. As such, the ending of the play, Our School in 1960, is ambiguous and somewhat contradictory.
So the quality of the productions the girls staged were, as you can see in this image here, there's nothing.
It's blank. Got it.
The productions were ambitious in terms of their dramaturgical structuring and their aesthetic presentation. So what you see here is an image of the passing of Arthur, and it emulates the aesthetics of some of the influential artists and writers of the Irish literary revival era. So here, it's emulating an early collection of Yeats's poetry, which was published in 1895. So Yeats articulates in First Principles in Samhain in 1904, and I'm quoting from Yeats here, "Illusion is impossible and should not be attempted." The end of the quote. theatre makers of the Irish Literary Theatre, other revivalist or nationalist theatre groups or cultural societies, and later the Irish National Theatre Society, or what became the Abbey, embraced this view, which was essentially a rejection of the mechanical and the spectacular, but often hackneyed tricks of the commercial stage. And this movement away from commerce and towards artistry led to a simplified playing style in an attempt to rediscover the expressive qualities of the body and the voice. There was also a rediscovery of the intimacy of the theatre space and a renewed interest on the part of dramatists and producers as to how the size and the shape of the stage and the auditorium impacted on the audience's experience of the production. So Yeats argued for a small, intimate auditorium, writing that, and I'm quoting again, "The stage opening, the powerful light and shade, the number of feet between myself and the players have destroyed intimacy." So the actors were asked to move less, but with more expressivity. And the staging was simplified to create an intimate but separate strangeness between players and audiences that only the theatre could create. So I'm going to pause there because I know that Fergie has been working very hard and you've been here listening very hard. So we're going to take a break. What would you think about it? Yeah? 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Yeah. Great. Thank you. You could be thinking. Chatting. Great. Yeah.
Just keep it. Hello, just before, I just want to introduce the speakers by their full name. Dr. Una Keeley and Dr. Kate McCarthy. And they're both from the Southeast Technological University. Okay, all right, can you see? Will I do that again? Sorry, do that again. Couldn't see. So just again, choose by full name. Una Deevy and Dr. And they're from the Southeast Technological University. And they're here to talk about the deaf playwright, Teresa Deevy. Okay, thanks, you're welcome.
So before the break, Kate was talking about the importance of a new style of theatre that was happening in the Abbey Theatre. This pared back, simple style with emphasis on the body, with emphasis on stillness, on intimacy, and on quietness. And these are all hallmarks of Teresa Deevy's work. So even though she was only at school during this time, we can see many of the aspects of the new style of performance happening in the Abbey that run through into Deevy's work in the 1930s. It was a move, as Kate said, away from showiness, away from mechanical acting, away from spectacle, away from falseness. This attempt to get to the truth. And if we return to what Mary Deevy advised her daughter, she said, look to the house and tell these small stories. And so we're beginning to see a playwright whose interest is particularly well suited to this new and innovative style of theatre production. But in a way, there were two types of evolution of theatre practice in Ireland at this time. We had the playwrights who went to the heroic Irish past, the legends, the myths of Diarmaid and Grania, Deirdre of the Sorrows. And we had the playwrights who went into realism and went into the cottages and began to excavate that life and that world. And Kathleen Nagulin is a kind of a mix of the two. We have the great myth of Kathleen, but also situated in this really domesticated space. And while a lot of Deevy's work takes us into this domesticated space, some of the work, one work in particular, which is Possession, takes us into the heart of Irish myth and Irish legend, but does so in a way that's slightly different to what other playwrights are doing. So we're moving in that trajectory in terms of the lecture. I'm kind of giving you a little teaser to get you to move us on. I talked about our school in 1960. But in addition to plays squinting into the future, the girls also wrote plays that looked back into the past. And one of those plays was a play called The Return of Columkill or The Saving of the Bards. It has two names. Very like Teresa Deevy's play called Possession or Cattle of the Gods. So here we can see an influence that, again, if we pull the thread through, we can understand where Deevy's artistic inspiration is coming from. And Kate and I really believe that the years that she spent in St. Mary's in Waterford with this theatrical activity, with the fact that the literary revival was such a part of the school day and of the creative ethos of the school, and we can see how that's really influencing Deevy later on. On the screen now, you can see the return of Columkill or The Saving of the Bards. But I haven't the clicker. You'll also see in the next few photos other productions that the girls were taking place in St. Mary's. They were very much in line with those of the revivalist artists of all disciplines who sought to create, and I'm quoting,
The pictures are there. We pass.
So is there another one there?
The kings.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So these artists of the Celtic literary revival were seeking to create, and I quote, a great, distinctive, poetic literature. And that's exactly what the girls in St. Mary's were trying to do as well. The similarities that you can see on screen now between the aesthetic and the non-realistic theatre that the girls created and the production created by the Abbey. So what you see on stage here now is a comparison between a Yeats production and a production by the girls. And you can see there the similarity between costume, between subject matter, and the aesthetic, even the shapes that the body is making in those photographs. In that photograph shows how closely influenced the girls were. Also, the performers in St. Mary's were subject to many of the same restrictions faced by the Abbey Theatre. They didn't have much room. They had a small stage. They didn't have much money. They handmade their own costumes. So while I'm not saying that the productions were identical, what I'm saying is that the style of theatre that the girls were creating allowed them, it was to their advantage because the simplicity, the discipline, the stillness of the body was all something that they could achieve actually with all of their limited resources. What they created was a pared back visual aesthetic, which was also the aesthetic of the realist Abbey Theatre productions. So Kate will take over now and talk a little bit about Deevy's early career at the Abbey. And she worked, I suppose, her plays in the Abbey lasted through the 30s.
So, Deevy submitted 2 plays, Reserved Ground and After Tomorrow, to the Abbey Reading Committee in the 1920s. Unfortunately, these were rejected. However, the first of her plays, entitled Reapers, was produced there in 1930. And this play is now a lost play. No copy that we know of or anyone else knows of survives. And John Jordan, a critic, he quotes a line attributed to one of the characters in this play, and that character's name is Jack Doherty, who says, "Patty believes, and so do I, that life's meant to be lived, not accepted." So we like this line as kind of representative of the kind of plays that Deevy writes, where she's challenging us not to accept, but to think. The novelist and the poet Mary Leslie, who wrote under the pseudonym Temple Lane, quotes another character from the play. That character's name is Lena. And Lena says, "I'll marry. That's the best in the long run. You're settled then for life. Or if it turns out unhappy, you can take up something with real interest then, because you won't be thinking of marriage any longer. Yes, I'll marry." So these are the kinds of themes that we see in Deevy's work. These themes where she is asking us and inviting us to challenge societal norms, and that at the time were governing how people behaved or thought they should behave. And often women were being asked to compromise their life choices, usually for marriage. And so these kind of challenges remain central in Deevy's work. Another play entitled, originally entitled In Search of Valor, but now known as A Disciple. And that was staged in 1931. Her next play was entitled Temporal Powers. Temporal Powers, and that was staged in 1932. Then we have one of our favorites, The King of Spain's Daughter, which you'll hear a lot about for the rest of the day. That was in 1935. And Katie Roach and The Wild Goose were performed in 1936. So you can see here that Deevy was very popular during the 1930s at the Abbey. And shall we move on to possession? Yeah. Yeah.
On screen, you can see images taken. The image on the left is a drawing from St. Ursula's animal, and the image on the right is an illustration from Yates's play Apropos as well. And you can see how similar the aesthetic is. And the image that we see here is on the left-hand side, we see one of the girls in costume, St. Mary's, and on the right-hand side, we can see the old man again from Apropos as well. And the character costume, the image is almost like I'm going to move on slides to get to possession. You will excuse me flicking through. We'll talk about Deevy's play possession. Yeah. On the screen, which you can read, is a note about possession. And I'll read that. These bulls are, according to Irish legends, of the gods. And they are sent on earth as two warring spirits, always bringing death and disaster. They have come as ravens, as swine herds, etc. Always spirits of conflict.
So what Deevy is doing is, yes, she's returning to the myths and the legends of Ireland, like that was done in the decades before. But what she does in this ballet poem Possession, or ballet Possession, excuse me, is instead of making it about King Alil and the bull, she centralizes the woman's character and experience. So she creates a very powerful, sexual, ambitious, brave warrior who is also a negotiator. And in this way, she is putting on the stage a challenge to other representations of women that we've seen in the majority of drama and theatre on the stage at this time. And what we've also been so privileged to be exploring with Leanne Quigley and Alvine Jones and Amanda Coogan and Dublin Theatre of the Deaf, and with our students, is another through line in this play, which is that she's also exploring partition. So she's really, this is a very politically driven play in terms of what's going on in Ireland at the time, and in terms of equality and the politics of gender. So what we know about Possession is that it is an outline script for a ballet that, to the best of our knowledge, has never been performed during Deevy's lifetime or since. It is 3 short pages and it hasn't been discussed, adapted, or researched until this year, we think. We know. So it is a fragment really in the Deevy archive. And it is such a fragment of value because it is reframing this Irish myth. It's based upon the myth of the time where Queen Maeve is the figure. And the extract that Luna read here, you can hear in that Deevy is exploring a different kind of storytelling, of retelling of this text, of this story, that is more symbolic, that is more abstract. And that is why it has been so attractive to play with this fragment with Leanne, Alvin, and our students most recently, and Amanda, of course. So we'll let Una finish to talk about kind of what we are making of this fragment.
We know that Deevy had a copy of Yeats's poetic 4 plays for dancers in her own library, with her own name in the flyleaf. We know that at school, the theatrical activity and creativity was absolutely encouraged. On a practical level, the girls had to make the costumes, write the plays, perform in the plays, stage the plays. We know that the school had a unique and progressive educational ethos where the girls were given voice and politicized. We know that Deevy was encouraged from the outset of her career by many women, her mother foremost among these, to think about women's lives and put these lives into dramatic practice. We know that the Irish literary revival went into the heart of heroic myth and legend to celebrate Ireland's unique history. Often in a way that was, as I said, slightly vampiric, whereby the blood of the young men would be shed in order for Ireland to be made great again. Possession does all of these things and twists some of them. It goes back into Irish myth, but it takes an Irish myth and it centralizes the woman. It changes that woman from passive to a woman who confers sovereignty, who is sexual, who is brassy, who is unafraid, who is unafraid to go into battle. But what happens in that battle is she becomes disillusioned. She sees death and destruction on the battlefield. She sees the death of her people, and she cannot go on. She's withered by this. And that's different. That disillusionment is very different in terms of how Irish heroic myths have been translated. The other thing that happens in possession is that there is a bull called the White Horn. It's Maeve's bull. It deserts her. She goes to steal the brown bull from Cooley. The bulls battle. The white bull dies. The brown bull is victorious for seconds until it dies. This is not the ending we want. And that is in line with the ending of Deevy's plays. She generally doesn't give us the ending we want. She gives us an ending that leaves us confused and dissatisfied, that makes us think, about women, that makes us think about war, that makes us think about how conflict is resolved. It gives us a warning about how our society might evolve if we don't pay attention to equality, to inclusivity, to diversity. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move on through the morning and the afternoon. And so it just remains for me to thank Bernie particularly for the translation and to thank you all for listening.
Thank you for your presentation. Wow. Thank you for your presentation. And now we have time for a little bit of a break. We're a little bit over time. So we're going to go to the Hub Cafe and have tea or coffee, biscuits, and then for 15 minutes or so, and then come back. And then we will have another second presentation again. And then we'll have a questions and answers if you feel that you want to ask questions and answers, yeah?
Instead of doing a second presentation, we're actually going to do a more active session because you've been listening for a lot this morning. So maybe when we come back, if it's okay, Annie, we might do the Q&A if you have some questions first. And so, or if you'd like to go straight in, it's going to be great fun. There is not too much acting in it.
I think we can have questions and answers after the break.
Yes, perfect. Great. So we do Q&A after the break. Is that okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good idea. And we'll come back with fresh minds.
Yes, thank you.
So we'll all head over to the Hub now. So, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I love Teresa Deevy. Today I've learned more and more, that was quite surprising, to learn about her early years. So I'd like to ask you just briefly, for those who don't know about Teresa Deevy, she was deafened around age 20, 19, 20, and she also had a deaf sister. So just in brief, maybe some of you would like to know about that. And do you know much about her deaf sister? That's okay, if you could briefly talk about her experience of becoming deaf and her deaf sister. And another thing is, I love Teresa Deevy's relationship that she had with her sister. Maybe I'm too early, maybe that's something we'll explore later or not. Just her relationship with her sister. So so if you could explain some of that today. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. So yes, she became deaf as a result of Meniere's disease. So we have learned from Leanne and Alvine to talk about her as a deafened writer. And like we were saying, she learned what age? She was early 20s, isn't it? Early 20s.
She was in her first year of an arts degree in UCD when she was deafened, and she stopped her arts degree in UCD. She became, we believe, a patient of the Ioneer Hospital in Cork, and we think then that she continued her studies, her arts degree in UCC, because it was convenient to the Ioneer Hospital in Cork. And we believe that she graduated from UCC with her arts degree. But we have never seen evidence that she graduated. And as researchers, we're careful not to continue a narrative just because other people have said it happened. So while I'm sure it probably did, what part of the work that we need to do involves going to get that confirmation in UCC.
Yeah, that piece of the jigsaw. And then she was encouraged to go to London to study lip reading. So she went there and she learned to lip read by watching the stage and by watching the actors. And that is, well, we know, I suppose, from what we were talking about this morning, well, we can assume that she was writing plays during her time at secondary school. So she had that experience. And then it was really the London experience where she was watching Shaw and Chekhov, one of her favorites, that we think that she decided the life of the playwright is the life for me.
She says in her autobiographical note that she wanted to write an Irish play in the Russian manner. So she wanted to emulate Chekhov, who writes about with this very nuanced attention to how conversations happen in real life. And in Chekhov's plays, characters often talk about the weather when they want to say really important things. Instead of saying really important things, they talk about the weather. And the really important things that they say are said actually through the body. And that's where Deevy's subtext lies. And she wrote her plays into the actor's body so that the subtext could be expressed in that way. So we're moving on to a little bit of talking about Deevy as a playwright, but in terms of her sister Frances also contracted Meniere's disease and also became deaf. And Frances was, I think, about 10 years older than Teresa Deevy. She died, I think, 25 years after Teresa Deevy died. So she had a very long life in comparison. We know very little about Frances's deafness. The other key relationship that Alvin, you mentioned, was her relationship with Nell, her sister. In obituaries of Deevy, we hear their relationship described as Tessa being the voice and Nell being the ears of the partnership. So we believe that Nell translated, probably using some version of home sign, to Teresa, or more than likely through a more pronounced lip reading if Teresa couldn't hear. We know that, and that relationship was extremely important. After Nell died in 1954, Teresa, who had been living between Dublin and London, or between Dublin and Waterford, continued living in Dublin until she died in 63, and we believe she came back to live in Waterford full time in 61, possibly 62. And she came back because she had to mind Frances, Fan, as she called her. And in her correspondence to her friend, James Chasty, she talks about, I'd love to be with you in Dublin. I'd love to go to that production, but see where I am.
Yeah, so she talks this set of letters that we have. And she's writing to James Chasty, who is another Waterford playwright, 34 years her junior. And she's mentoring him in this brilliant way. And the letters are very focused really on how to be a playwright. But there are these postcards in the collection. And it's in the postcards a lot of the time that it's revealed, more of her personal life is revealed, just like Una is saying about, you know, I can't attend there because I'm here. This is my sister. We get it. She doesn't talk a lot about her experience as a deaf person, but you get kind of glimpses of it in what she's saying. But one of the really important things we realized through that research is that even though she was a deaf writer, it did not stop her getting involved in what was happening in Dublin, even when she was geographically removed. She knew who the contemporary people were, contemporary producers, directors. She was in the scene. She was always pushing for her work, the new work that she was creating. And some of you may or may not know, a lot of her work in the 40s and 50s was produced by Radio Éireann. And their story, she would attend these broadcasts, and she was behind a screen pre-COVID times, looking at the actors performing. But that's been a really significant finding for us, that in the letter she talks about all the time, this person, you must talk to this person. I've spoken to them, but you know, they're not really returning my calls. Or I wonder why they haven't come back to me about that. You know, she's persistent. And that's a part of the narrative that has not been explored about Deevy, and that we're really trying to champion. That when she was rejected by the Abbey in the 30s, her career and her creativity did not end there.
And I suppose what we are also keen to do is to challenge the narrative of, and I'm quoting from her own relatives, poor Tessa, who was forgotten by the Abbey, poor Tessa, who was deaf, poor Tessa, who wasn't married, poor Tessa, who was from Waterford. All of these perceived disadvantages that she had. Our analysis of her correspondence is that she regarded none of these as disadvantages, that she turned every aspect of her own life experience into material for her art. And we know that when she went to the theatre, because she writes to Jim Chasty and asks him to get her seats in the middle of the circle so she can have a center view, so she can be properly elevated, so she can see what's happening. So she used her deafness in the same way that she used all of her life experience, as a way to think about how people communicate and what they are trying to communicate, and was so sensitive to the fact that people say so much through their body. They say the truth through their body, where they often don't say the truth through their mouth. Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking of my own body as I stand here.
Me too.
And I'm relaxed. I'm relaxed, and I'm thinking, yeah, that's my body is telling the truth. I'm happy to be here. I'm really comfortable in this space talking about Teresa Deevy. I'm in my happy place. And that if Deevy was in the audience, she'd be taking note of my body. And she'd be trying to write that into her play, I think. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, we have another question.
Yes, thank you. There's another question here. Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you. Another question from I have two questions. The first question. You know, during COVID lockdown, we had a quick Deevy presentation on Zoom. We talked about Teresa's art pride, and she left some art things under the bed, wasn't that right? So that was the first thing I was going to ask you. And then secondly, the question, the Abbey Theatre rejected her. Was it because she was a woman, or because she was deaf, or was it both? Just those two questions.
Thank you, Sandra. One of my obsessions is what was in the suitcases and how many suitcases there are. So they were under the bed. The suitcases were under the bed in the family home called Landscape. One part of the story is that there was one suitcase with lots of material in it. So the material would have been typed transcripts, annotated transcripts, other fragments. So the accepted narrative is there's kind of one suitcase with it all in there. There's another thing that we've just come upon, that actually there was another green suitcase in which there were possibly more things. So there was certainly one suitcase or suitcases that the archive was divided across. And what happened was Deevy and her family were really generous. So anyone, a researcher or anyone with any interest, could approach them, and they were given things on loan. Most of those were returned to the suitcases. And I'm conscious of Sarah, our archivist, thinking the archive under the bed. But some things perhaps weren't. So, for example, we mentioned the script Reapers that we think was loaned to a scholar based in India called Nethamal Sahal, sorry. We know that he is the last person to reference the original typescript. But it was never returned to our knowledge. So I will have to stop talking because I'll go on about the suitcases. And then it was Professor Christopher Morash who was very conscious of the value of this archive, and he worked with the Deevy family to preserve it and conserve it by making it an official, or they donated it to Maynooth University Library. So that is where the archive, and they have done a really magnificent job and made it publicly available. And I think they're actually working on the website again so that it will even be more accessible. So that's a tiny bit, but I will stop on some.
Kate can go on for a long time. Try to see Kate. I would just one more point to add about the archive. We have been thinking about women's literary archives, Kate and I, over the past 6 months, and using Deevy's archive in particular as a focus for our thinking. And women's literary archives are treated in a different way often to men's literary archives. And we've been thinking about why this is the case. And sometimes it's the case because women have less value on their own body of work. And so they keep it in suitcases and it doesn't go anywhere. And then their family have a narrative around that work, and its value diminishes over time. And it is right to say that the Deevy family cared for that archive to the best of their ability. They were not professional archivists. Nobody was interested in that suitcases. Nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted that work. And the archive is still an archive that is rich for scholars. There's lots of work to be done there. Kate and I have just finished an article for Irish University Review, talking about the importance and the value of Deevy's correspondence. Nobody's ever thought about Deevy's correspondence in any systematic way. If these were the letters of Yeats or of Heaney or of Joyce, people would have written books about these things and they would be really important. People have mentioned scraps of Deevy's correspondence, but nobody has thought systematically about the value of that. So our argument is that her correspondence is high value. It's as important as her work. We take a feminist perspective and we say that Deevy's life and her lived experience is a really rich asset in terms of understanding her work. So that's the kind of trajectory that we are moving in terms of thinking about the archive. And that is why Kate McCarthy is so concerned about the suitcases.
And Sandra, to come back to your second question then, I suppose it's all of those issues. Like, we know that in the 30s, women were experiencing oppression, but it was intersectional. So, Deevy was a woman, I suppose she had some power because she was unmarried, which in one way, and also because she was now deafened. So I think you named a couple of things there that certainly contributed. And the other thing, I suppose, and Una can talk a bit more about this, was the major shift in the Abbey in terms of financials, that they just, Ernest Blythe did not want to support that kind of work, and instead was accessing grants to do with the Irish language. So the Abbey was moving in that direction for another few decades. But certainly, yeah, I mean, the kind of plays that we talked about this morning, you can see the kind of the challenge she was putting up to society about women and the oppressions, the different oppressions they faced at a time when Ireland is discussing the Constitution and leaving behind the more radical ideals of equality that were the dream of the Irish Free State into a much more restrictive constitution.
And so let's just think about what kind of an Ireland Deevy is portraying. In The King of Spain's Daughter, we have a young girl who is beaten by her father. She's taken off stage to be beaten, while the people on stage say, do nothing, right? And in Katie Roach, we've got the Katie who is illegitimate. She won't be accepted by Michael's mother because of her want of a name. So she's pushing all the time. In Wife to James Whelan, which was the play that was rejected by the Abbey, and I'm careful not to put all the blame on Ernest Blythe, because the Abbey had a reading committee. It wasn't, he wrote the letter, but he wasn't all of the people who sat around at the reading committee. So it's too easy to pin it on one person. But in Wife to James Whelan, we have, without doubt, a homosexual character, a young, beautiful young man. Adonis, he's called, in case we don't know how beautiful he is. We have a woman who is married. She has a baby. Her husband dies. She's left minding the baby and her father-in-law, who he nearly sets himself on fire when she goes out one day. So it's very clear she can't leave the house. She's starving. She is wasting away in front of us. And she is reduced from this beautiful, sparkling woman in Act 1 to a drudge scrubbing the floor in Act 3. She has disappeared. Her individuality has been erased with a shawl. Right? This is Deevy's Ireland. And we have a former Minister of Finance who has celebrated Ireland and has been active in the Civil War and who is in a position of power. And you've got De Valera writing the new constitution, clawing back in that constitution all of the equality that was written into the proclamation in 1916. Deevy's Ireland is not the Ireland. Deevy's Ireland is not the Ireland that perhaps the hierarchy and I'm including the church and state, wanted on the national stage, which is being funded by the government.
Can I add just one small thing to that, because I'm conscious of the time? In the minute books, so you can see these, the Abbey Theatre minute books, and read what was happening at the meetings at this time. Ernest Blythe issued a contract to Deevy for her last play, and Deevy is persistent. Deevy knows from we can tell this from the letters she is writing, which are read out at the meetings and therefore minuted. She knows that they're not moving, something's not working. So she's writing saying, what about my play? What about my play? Like, she knows, I think. And instead of being professional and writing to a playwright and saying, actually, this is not the season for your play, they let the contract run out, they let it lapse. And they take instead a play called Boyd's Shop, written by a playwright called St. John Irvine, ironically, to whom Deevy really looks up to in terms of his thoughts in playwriting. And you can read about that in the minute books. If you Google that, the archive it's in Galway, the Abbey Theatre.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kate. I'll do that. Time is really long here. So thank you to Sandra and Leanne for your questions. And it's great that you brought up some valuable points there. These are really important. And now the next part of the day
Is it workshop? A workshop.
the workshop. So after lunch, we'll have drama, Leanne and Amanda. How are we doing? Lunch.
No, that's us. That's us.
Oh,
That's us too.
that's and the Dublin Theatre Picture.
Yeah, don't worry.
Okay, after. Okay. Okay, so the workshop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Recording. Okay, I'm just asking, okay, yes, the workshop will be recorded, only the questions and answers, but the workshop discussions, no. Okay.
So your first task